Officer, "Sir, you were warned to disperse. This is an unlawful assembly." The riot gear-clad officer shouted, his voice amplified by a bullhorn, just before the crackle hiss of a taser split the air. 2-year-old Arthur Jenkins, A Decorated World. Warded 2 veteran leaning heavily on his walker, cried out as the electrical shock hit him, collapsing onto the pavement amidst the protest signs. He'd just been standing quietly, holding a small flag. 8 minutes later, as fellow protesters shielded Arthur, the chaotic sounds of the demonstration were abruptly overshadowed by the silent, imposing arrival of a fleet of black SUVs, disgorging, stern-faced men in dark suits, hidden sparks. If you believe the right to peacefully protest is sacred, especially for those who fought for it, type First Amendment below. Arthur Jenkins, at 90 years young, had seen more history unfold than most people read about. He'd landed on bloody beaches in his youth, faced down enemy tanks, and returned home to a nation he'd fought to protect, carrying both visible and invisible scars. His small apartment was a quiet testament to a life of service. A few carefully preserved medals in a glass case, photographs of his late wife Eleanor and his comrades in arms. His body was frail now, his steps aided by a 4-wheeled walker adorned with a small American flag, but his spirit remained fiercely independent, his belief in the foundational principles of his country unwavering. When he heard about the planned, peaceful protest downtown, a gathering of concerned citizens, many of them elderly, protesting proposed cuts to veterans' health care benefits and Social Security, he felt a familiar call to duty. These weren't radical notions, they were about promises made about dignity in old age. He donned his VFW cap, pinned a small replica of his Purple Heart to his modest windbreaker, and made his way slowly but resolutely to City Hall Plaza, his walker clicking rhythmically on the sidewalk. He wasn't there to cause trouble, merely to bear witness, to add his presence to the call for justice. The protest was indeed peaceful, a few dozen people, mostly seniors, holding handmade signs. They chanted softly, listened to speakers, a far cry from a riotous mob. The city, however, perhaps overreacting to online chatter or simply flexing its muscle, had dispatched a surprisingly large contingent of police in full riot gear. They formed a tight, intimidating line, shields up, batons visible, faces obscured by visors. Captain Miller, the officer in charge, seemed determined to disperse the small gathering quickly. Captain Miller, "This is an unlawful assembly. You have been warned to disperse. If you do not leave the area immediately, you will be subject to arrest and the use of force." Arthur Jenkins stood near the edge of the small crowd, leaning on his walker, his small flag held steadily. He wasn't chanting, wasn't shouting, just standing his ground, a silent testament. Other protesters looked nervously at the heavily armed police line, but held their positions. They believed they had a right to be there. "Captain Miller, this is your final warning. Disperse now." He then gave a sharp nod to his officers. Several of them, including a young, nervous-looking officer named Peterson, advanced on the protesters, batons raised. Panic rippled through the small crowd. Some started to back away, but others, including Arthur, stood firm, bewildered by the sudden escalation. Officer Peterson, perhaps caught up in the adrenaline of the moment, or misinterpreting Captain Miller's aggressive posture, singled out Arthur. Maybe it was the walker making him an easy, slow-moving target. Maybe it was the flag, a symbol of the very rights Peterson was about to violate. "Officer Peterson, you old man, I told you to move." Arthur tried to speak, to explain he was just standing peacefully, but his words were lost in the rising chaos. Peterson, seeing only defiance in the old man's stance, unholstered his taser. "Officer Peterson, I said move," before Arthur could fully comprehend what was happening, before any other protester could effectively intervene. Peterson fired the taser. The barb struck Arthur in the chest. 90 years of resilience, of history, of quiet dignity crumpled as the electricity coursed through his frail body. He cried out, a thin, pained sound, and collapsed onto the cold concrete, his walker clattering beside him, his small flag falling from his grasp, his VFW cap tumbling off, revealing his thin, white hair. Several protesters screamed, rushing forward to shield Arthur, horrified. Protester, "He's 90 years old. He's a veteran. What are you doing, you monsters?" Captain Miller, seeing the old man go down and the crowd's angry reaction, seemed to hesitate for a split second, perhaps realizing they'd crossed a line. But the damage was done. Officer Peterson stood frozen, taser still in hand, staring at the fallen veteran with wide, shocked eyes, the reality of his actions beginning to dawn. The peaceful protest had turned ugly, violent, all because of an unnecessary, brutal escalation against non-violent elderly citizen. Amidst the chaos and shouting, as some protesters tried to render aid to Arthur and others angrily confronted the police line, one protester was already on her phone. She wasn't calling 911. She was calling a different kind of number, a direct line to a powerful figure in Washington, D.C., who had a very particular interest in the welfare of veterans, especially those mistreated while exercising their constitutional rights. She spoke quickly, urgently, detailing the tasing of a 90-year-old Wabiwetu as veteran at a peaceful protest by overzealous police. She gave the location, the time, the nature of the protest. The voice on the other end listened intently, asked a few curt questions, then said simply, "Voice. Understood. Sit tight. Help is on the way." Less than 8 minutes later, the cacophony of the protest, the shouting, the sirens of approaching ambulances, Captain Miller's renewed bullhorn demands to disperse, was abruptly pierced by a new sound, the low, powerful thrum of multiple engines, accompanied by the almost silent whoosh of expensive tires on pavement. Heads turned. Even the riot police looked confused. Sweeping around the corner, ignoring the hastily erected police barricades as if they were minor inconveniences, came a convoy of sleek black SUVs. Not just one or two, but at least 5, windows tinted to an impenetrable sheen, government plates just visible. They moved with a silent, coordinated precision that spoke of high-level security and absolute authority. The lead SUV pulled directly up to the edge of the plaza, its doors opening before it had even fully stopped. Men in dark, impeccably tailored suits emerged, earpieces glinting. They didn't draw weapons, but their very presence, their calm, watchful intensity, immediately shifted the power dynamic of the entire scene. They fanned out, creating a secure perimeter, not around the police, but subtly around the area where Arthur Jenkins lay, now being attended to by arriving paramedics. Captain Miller, seeing these unidentified authoritative figures appear out of nowhere and essentially take control of his scene, strode forward, his face flushed with anger. Captain Miller, "Who the hell are you people? This is a restricted police operation. You're interfering." One of the suited men, clearly the team leader, turned to face Captain Miller. He was tall, lean, his expression unreadable. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held up a small, leather-bound credential case, flipping it open to reveal a badge that made Captain Miller stop dead in his tracks, his bluster deflating instantly. "Lead Agent Federal Agents, Captain, United States Secret Service, Dignitary Protection Detail, and a liaison from the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of the Secretary. We're here for Mr. Arthur Jenkins." Miller stared, speechless. "Secret Service? For this old protester?" As Captain Miller struggled to process this, the rear door of the central black SUV opened. Another figure emerged, not a suited agent, but a woman of immense quiet authority. It was Eleanor Vance, the newly appointed Secretary of Veterans Affairs, a highly respected former four-star general herself, known for her fierce advocacy for veterans' rights and her intolerance for bureaucratic abuse. She had been in the city for a conference and had received the urgent call from her Washington office just minutes earlier. Her face was a mask of cold fury as she surveyed the scene. The fallen elderly veteran, the riot police, the discarded protest signs. She walked directly toward where Arthur was being carefully placed on a stretcher, ignoring Captain Miller and the other police officers. Secretary, Vance, Mr. Jenkins, Arthur. I am Eleanor Vance, Secretary of Veterans Affairs. I am so profoundly sorry for what has happened to you here today. This is an outrage. Arthur, groggy but conscious, looked up at her, confusion in his eyes. Arthur, Secretary. But why, Secretary? Vance. Because, Arthur, no one who served this nation, especially a veteran of your generation and sacrifice, should ever be treated this way for exercising their fundamental rights. Ever. She then stood and faced Captain Miller, who had approached tentatively, now looking deeply apprehensive. Secretary Vance, Captain, you and your officers have tased a 90-year-old unarmed peaceful protester, a decorated combat veteran of War II. You have done so on public property during a permitted assembly. Explain yourself. Miller stammered about unlawful assembly, warnings to disperse, officer safety. Secretary Vance cut him off. Secretary Vance. Officer safety? From a 90-year-old man with a walker holding a flag? Your department's definition of a threat appears to be catastrophically flawed, Captain, as is your understanding of the First Amendment. She turned to the lead Secret Service agent. Secretary Vance. Agent Coulson, please secure all body cam footage from the officers involved, as well as any city surveillance footage of this plaza for the last hour. I want a full federal review of this incident commencing immediately. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division will be formally notified by my office within the hour. Agent Coulson nodded. Agent Coulson, already in progress, Madame Secretary. The police officers, including Peterson, who looked ready to dissolve into the pavement, realized the situation had escalated far beyond a local protest issue. They were now facing a federal investigation initiated at the cabinet level. The arrival of the Secretary of Veterans Affairs and her Secret Service detail turned the local protest incident into a national news story. The image of the frail 90-year-old veteran being tased, contrasted with the swift, high-level federal intervention, sparked outrage across the country. Captain Miller and Officer Peterson were immediately suspended pending the outcome of the federal investigation. The city's mayor and police chief found themselves issuing public apologies and promising sweeping reforms to protest policing and use of force policies, particularly concerning vulnerable populations. Arthur Jenkins was taken to the hospital, where Secretary Vance personally ensured he received the best possible care. His injuries from the tasing and fall were thankfully not life-threatening, but the emotional shock was significant. The secretary stayed with him until his family arrived. She assured them that the VA would cover all his medical expenses and that those responsible for his mistreatment would be held accountable. Secretary Vance, this is not just about Arthur Jenkins, though his case is egregious. This is about a sacred promise to all who have served. Their right to speak, to assemble, to protest peacefully is not negotiable. It was bought with their sacrifice, and my department, along with every level of government, has a duty to protect that right, not trample it with excessive force and callous indifference. The black SUVs remained a quiet, powerful presence in the city for several days as the initial federal inquiry began. The message was clear. Veterans were not to be trifled with, and their rights were not to be dismissed. Arthur, recovering, became a reluctant symbol of resilience and the fight for justice. He never asked for the spotlight, but his quiet courage in the face of aggression and the powerful response it triggered reminded the nation that even the oldest soldiers still deserved the fiercest defenders when their fundamental freedoms were assaulted, because when the rights of those who fought for all our rights are threatened, the response must be swift, decisive, and from the very top. Hidden Sparks. Subscribe to Hidden Sparks if you believe in protecting our protectors, and that true authority stands for justice, not oppression. Officer. Sir, I've told you 3 times to turn down that music. You're disturbing the peace, the young officer yelled, his face flushed with anger, pointing at the small, silent Bluetooth speaker on the park bench beside 80-year-old Thomas Ashton. Thomas, profoundly deaf. Since a combat explosion decades ago, hadn't heard a word. He just saw the officer's agitated face, then the sudden glint of a taser. The world exploded in pain. 6 minutes later, as Thomas lay dazed on the grass, the serene quiet of the church grounds was shattered by the thunderous arrival of Marine. Corpse Humvees disgorging uniformed figures who moved with grim, silent purpose. Hidden sparks. If you believe communication and compassion should precede force, type "Protect Our Vets" below. Thomas Ashton, at 80 years old, lived in a world of profound silence, a consequence of a concussive blast during his service as a Marine in a long-forgotten jungle war. The explosion had stolen his hearing, but not his spirit. He communicated through a mix of skilled lip-reading, gestures, and a small notepad he always carried. His life was quiet, centered around his small apartment, his meticulously tended rose, garden, and his weekly visits to St. Michael's Church, not for services, but for the peaceful solitude of its memorial garden, a place where he felt a connection to comrades lost and a sense of tranquility. He was a man of routine. His appearance, neat but unassuming, clean-pressed khakis, a simple collared shirt, and often his old, faded Marine Corps utility cap. Today, he'd brought his small, portable Bluetooth speaker and his phone to the church garden. He wasn't playing loud music. He was listening to a downloaded audiobook of poetry at a barely audible volume, the vibrations against the bench, a faint echo he could just perceive, a small comfort in his silent world. He sat on his usual bench facing the roses, lost in the narrative, the speaker beside him. The garden was mostly empty, a peaceful oasis in the bustling city. He was, by all appearances, a harmless elderly man enjoying a quiet afternoon. Officer Miller, young, ambitious, and with a reputation for being a stickler for minor ordinances, was on foot patrol. He'd received a complaint about loud, disturbing music coming from the church grounds. Miller, eager to demonstrate his proactive policing, marched into the memorial garden already primed for a confrontation. He saw Thomas on the bench, the small speaker beside him. He didn't see a deaf elderly man. He saw a noise violator, a public nuisance. He approached Thomas from behind, a common but problematic approach when dealing with someone who might be hearing impaired. Officer Miller, "Sir, you need to turn that music down. This is a place of worship, not a concert hall." Thomas, of course, heard nothing. He remained facing the roses, absorbed in his audiobook's faint vibrations. Miller, taking the lack of response as defiance, grew angrier. Officer Miller, "Hey, I'm talking to you. Are you deaf or just ignoring me?" He stepped closer. Now, directly beside Thomas, Officer Miller, "I said turn the music off now." Thomas, startled by the sudden appearance of an agitated uniformed officer directly in his peripheral vision, looked up, confused. He couldn't understand what the officer was shouting, couldn't hear the commands. He saw the angry face, the aggressive posture. He instinctively reached for the notepad and pen in his pocket, his usual method of communication. Miller, misinterpreting the movement as reaching for a weapon or further defiance, escalated. "Officer Miller, don't you reach for anything. Hands where I can see them. You were warned. You're disturbing the peace and failing to comply." Thomas, utterly bewildered, and now genuinely frightened by the officer's aggressive actions and incomprehensible shouting, tried to placate him with a calming hand gesture while still fumbling for his notepad to write, "I am deaf." But Officer Miller, his adrenaline surging, his training perhaps inadequate for de-escalating with a disabled individual, saw only continued non-compliance and perceived threat. "Officer Miller, that's it. You're resisting." Thomas saw the glint of the weapon, his eyes widening in terror. He tried to hold up his hands, to shake his head, to somehow convey his inability to hear, his harmlessness. But it was too late. With a sharp crackle, Officer Miller fired the taser. The barb struck Thomas in the shoulder and leg. He cried out, a choked sound of pain and shock, and crumpled from the bench onto the soft grass of the memorial garden, his old Marine Corps cap flying off, the small speaker tumbling beside him, now truly silent. Officer Miller stood over him, taser still pointed, breathing heavily, perhaps a flicker of doubt, now entering his eyes as he saw the elderly man spasming on the ground. A church groundskeeper, who had witnessed the entire exchange from a distance, rushed over shouting, "Groundskeeper! Stop! Stop! He's deaf! Old Mr. Ashton is deaf. He comes here all the time. He can't hear you." Miller lowered his taser slowly, his face paling, as the groundskeeper's words sank in. The groundskeeper was already on his phone, not to 911, but to a number he knew would get immediate attention. The direct line to the pastoral office of a retired Marine chaplain, Father Michael Ali, who served at St. Michael's and was a fierce advocate for local veterans. Father Ali, in turn, knew exactly who to call when a Marine, especially a disabled combat veteran, was unjustly harmed less than 6 minutes. That's all it took. As the groundskeeper and a now deeply shaken Officer Miller tried to assist Thomas, the quiet street outside St. Michael's Church erupted, not with sirens initially, but with the unmistakable, disciplined rumble of heavy-duty engines. 2 olive-drab Humvees, followed by a larger troop transport vehicle, turned sharply onto the street, their presence utterly incongruous with the peaceful church grounds. They didn't just park, they strategically positioned themselves, effectively sealing off vehicle access to the church's main entrance and the adjacent block. Doors opened, and a dozen U.S. Marines in full combat utility uniform disembarked with swift, silent precision. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They moved with the calm, controlled purpose of a unit securing a sensitive area. They formed a loose, observant perimeter around the church garden, their expressions grim, their presence an overwhelming statement. Officer Miller, who had just moments before felt in complete control, now looked small, terrified, and utterly out of his depth. The few pedestrians on the street stopped dead, staring in stunned disbelief. This wasn't a police action. This was something else entirely. From the lead Humvee, a figure emerged. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, but ramrod straight. His Marine Corps dress blues were immaculate despite the unexpected field deployment. It was Major General Patrick "Patty" Flynn, commander of the nearby Marine Corps Recruit Depot and a close personal friend of Father Ali from their active duty days. Father Ali had reached him mid-briefing. Flynn hadn't hesitated. General Flynn strode into the memorial garden, his eyes cold as gunmetal, taking in the scene. Thomas Ashton, now pale and trembling on the grass, attended by a frantic groundskeeper, the discarded taser wires, the young police officer standing frozen, looking like a child caught in a monumental transgression. Father Ali arrived moments behind the general, having rushed from his office. Father Ali, "Patty, thank God. It's Tom Ashton. They tased him. He's deaf, for heaven's sake." General Flynn knelt beside Thomas, his expression softening instantly. General Flynn, Tom, can you hear me? It's Patty Flynn." He gently took Thomas's hand. Thomas, dazed, focused on the general's face. A flicker of recognition in his pained eyes. He tried to lip-read, then fumbled for his notepad. The general nodded understandingly. General Flynn, "Don't try to talk, Tom. We've got you. Medics are en route." He then stood, his gaze sweeping over Officer Miller with an intensity that made the young cop flinch. "General Flynn, officer, you tased an 80-year-old, unarmed, profoundly deaf Marine veteran on church grounds for playing an audiobook. Explain yourself, and choose your words very, very carefully." Officer Miller stammered. "About noise complaints, failure to comply, perceived resistance." Each excuse sounded more pathetic, more damning, in the face of the general's icy calm and the ring of silent, watchful Marines. "General Flynn, failure to comply? Did you attempt to communicate with him in any way other than shouting, 'Officer'? Did you observe his white cane, which I presume he carries? Did you consider for one moment that a man his age in this peaceful place might not be a threat, but might instead have a disability that prevented him from understanding your commands?" He gestured to the small speaker. "General Flynn, that was his disturbance, an audiobook of poetry?" He shook his head, a look of profound disgust on his face. "General Flynn, you didn't just fail to de-escalate, officer. You failed to observe. You failed to think. You failed to uphold the most basic tenets of your duty to protect and serve, especially the vulnerable." The general turned to Father Ali. "General Flynn, Father, please ensure Thomas gets immediate medical attention. I want a full report from the attending physicians." He then faced Officer Miller again, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more menace than any shout. "General Flynn, Officer, your actions today are a disgrace to your uniform and an insult to every man and woman who has ever served this country, especially those who carry the invisible wounds of that service. You have traumatized a decorated combat veteran who has already sacrificed more than you can comprehend." He paused. "General Flynn, I will be speaking with your chief of police and the mayor personally within the hour. I will be demanding a full investigation, your immediate suspension, and a complete overhaul of your department's training on interacting with citizens with disabilities, particularly deaf and hard-of-hearing individuals, and most particularly our veterans." He gestured to the silent, imposing figures surrounding the garden. "General Flynn, my Marines will remain on site to ensure Mr. Ashton's belongings are secure and that no further misunderstandings occur until the situation is properly addressed by your superiors. They are not here to interfere with police business, merely to ensure the dignity and safety of one of their own is no longer compromised." Officer Miller looked like he was about to collapse. The arrival of paramedics provided a momentary distraction, and Thomas Ashton was carefully lifted onto a stretcher. As he was carried toward the ambulance, he looked toward General Flynn's EA, flicker of gratitude in his eyes. The general gave him a solemn, reassuring nod. The Marines remained a silent, powerful cordon as the local police supervisor, then the chief, then the mayor, all arrived in rapid, panicked succession, faced with a situation that had escalated from a minor bylaw infraction to a full-blown interagency crisis involving a tased deaf war hero and a very, very angry Marine general who had effectively used his resources to highlight a grievous wrong. The lesson was clear. Some lines, when crossed, bring a response far beyond anything one might expect, especially when those lines involve the mistreatment of those who have already given so much in silence. The ensuing days saw a firestorm of local media attention. Officer Miller was suspended, and the police department immediately launched an internal affairs investigation, alongside the one strongly encouraged by General Flynn and the Department of Veterans Affairs, which became involved at the general's insistence. Body cam footage, when released, starkly confirmed the groundskeeper's account and Thomas Ashton's complete inability to have heard the officer's commands. The city implemented emergency retraining for its entire police force on ADA compliance, de-escalation techniques, and specific protocols for interacting with deaf and hard-of-hearing individuals, with Marine Corps EOD experts offering to consult. Thomas Ashton recovered physically, though the incident left him shaken. General Flynn and Father Ali visited him regularly, ensuring he had all the support he needed. The Marine Corps League and other veterans organizations rallied, offering legal assistance and public advocacy. The small Bluetooth speaker became a minor symbol of the incident. Donations poured into local deaf advocacy groups and veteran support networks in Thomas's name. Officer Miller eventually resigned from the force before the conclusion of the investigation. The city issued a formal apology to Thomas Ashton and instituted a new Thomas Ashton protocol for all first responders, mandating immediate checks for indicators of hearing impairment or other disabilities before escalating any interaction. Thomas, man who had always preferred the quiet, found himself a reluctant catalyst for change. He eventually returned to his peaceful afternoons in the church garden, his new speaker playing poetry at a low volume, the vibrations of familiar comfort. But now, local police officers, when they saw him, would often offer a respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of the day the Marines came to St. Michael's, all because one of their own, living in a world of silence, was unjustly harmed, and his brothers in arms refused to let that silence be mistaken for helplessness. Because true camaraderie never fades, and the call to protect a fellow Marine, regardless of age or circumstance, echoes louder than any siren. Hidden Sparks. Subscribe to Hidden Sparks if you believe in justice for our veterans and that communication is always the first best action.